Good morning, everyone. So we'll get started in a minute. I imagine there's a few more people that are going to be coming in, but I wanted to obviously give you guys an overview of period 7. It is a massive period. It has more stuff going on in it than all the other periods. There are many different DBQ questions that could potentially come from this period. And so I want to break it down with you guys before you finish your cheat sheets for tonight. So we're going to get started in about another minute. But if you could just, obviously, if you want to take notes, or if you want to, I don't even care, have your template out or your sheet out in front of you and just type into it, that's fine. But whatever works best, so we can hopefully get this stuff submitted and ready to go in preparation for the practice test that's happening later this week. So without further ado, let's begin, because there's a lot to get through here. So it's really hard trying to simplify period 7 into 3 essential stories. And so you're going to see, I'm going to go through these 3 stories, but you have to understand that some of them are pretty long, and they've got a lot of parts that are involved in them. So be aware of that and make note of that when you talk about what each story entails. When you are putting together your cheat sheet for this, understand that, we talk about the changing role of government, there's multiple kind of aspects to that. And then we want to know them so that we can hopefully bring in those ideas into any kind of question that we might see. So let's look at the period 7 timeline that's in front of us and understand that we're covering really essentially from 1890 all the way to 1945. And the things that frame period 7, there's a little overlap again with period 6. And it starts in 1890 because this is the beginnings of the progressive era. We see that in 1890 with the start of the antitrust movement and the movement at local levels to try to get government to reform some of the problems that they see happening as a result of big business. And then it is going to walk us through, or it's going to take us all the way through the end of World War II, where we see America's role in the world dramatically shifting. So we're going to kind of just go through all the different things that are happening in period 7 through these 3 stories. And we're going to begin with our first story, which is something new in American history, and that is imperialism. So one of the, a big part of period 7 in general is just way more foreign affairs than we've seen in our previous periods that we've talked about. So there is obviously not that much foreign affairs that we've discussed in periods 3, 4, 5, and 6, but now foreign affairs is kind of taking a center stage for this period. And it starts to happen with this process of imperialism. Now, for those that don't remember what imperialism is, this is the process of the United States going out and trying to build an empire for themselves. So America is trying to extend its power and its influence, not just within the continental United States, but overseas into new territories. Now, the beginnings of this story of imperialism is really a story of early expansion, and specifically the Spanish-American War, which takes place in 1898. Now, there's a number of different reasons why the United States went to try to imperialize. Some of it has to do with a desire for new markets through industrialization. Some of it has to do with feelings of cultural superiority that we see with Josiah Strong and the white man's burden. For others, it was a desire for growing military power. There's Alfred Mahan, who wanted to build up our naval power. Despite all these different reasons, and there were many, America decides to kind of go overseas and start to expand its power. It does that with the Spanish-American War. And through that war, America gains new territories. It gains Puerto Rico. It gains the Philippines, which it annexes, and it even gains influence over places like Cuba with the Platt Amendment. And so now the United States has a larger role in the world. And even though the Spanish-American War is over, it does not stop America's kind of imperial policies, which are going to continue for the next 3 presidents. So imperialism begins under William McKinley, who was a Republican, very pro-business. And it's going to continue under Teddy Roosevelt, who comes afterwards, after McKinley is assassinated, and then Taft, and finally Woodrow Wilson. And you need to know how they continue these concepts of imperialism. So you need to understand how Teddy Roosevelt has the big stick diplomacy, where he's going to essentially use diplomacy. He's going to negotiate, but he's willing to use force in order to try to expand the power and influence of the United States. We see that with the Panama Canal. We also see it with the Roosevelt Corollary, which is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. After that is Tower diplomacy, which is Taft, who's arguing that the United States should get involved with things when it's in our economic interests. So collecting debts, for example. And then there's Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is all about moral diplomacy, which is getting involved overseas in order to spread American democratic values. Important to know about Woodrow Wilson, while his moral diplomacy does extend to most parts of the world, like other imperial presidents, he was willing to kind of abandon moral diplomacy if it was in our economic best interests, especially in like the Western Hemisphere, in parts of the Caribbean and South America and in Mexico. Now, it is important to note that not every single person in America was imperialist, that there were plenty of people that opposed America's expansion in the world, saw imperialism as an opposite of what we were supposed to value as a country, that we were abandoning our anti-colonization views, our views of trying to promote the independence around the country. And we see people like especially William Jennings Bryan, who is speaking out against imperialism. We see the challenges to imperialism in the form of the insular cases. We even see local groups of people that are fighting American influence in their country. The best example of that would be Emilio Aguinaldo, who opposed the United States annexation of the Philippines. Now, this story of imperialism is really going to take us all the way up to World War I. And it helps us understand American foreign policy for really the first, I guess, almost 30 years of this time period. And so that's an important story for us to know, and that's why it's going to be one of the main stories that you need to write down for your review sheet. The other story, and I'm going to tell you, this story is massive, so you have to understand this, is that starting in the 1890s in period 7, we are going to see the government having a much larger role in the lives of its people. And so we have to kind of just setting the stage for this, thinking about period 6, we have to understand that we are coming off of a time period of laissez-faire. The government is not super involved in the lives of the people. In period 6, it was business that was for the most part driving America and driving the economy. And what we start to see in period 7 is a backlash to that. We see the calls by people to get more involved, for the government to get more involved in regulating business and fixing problems in society. Now, I'd like to point out that the overall trajectory of the role of government in period 7 is to increase. That doesn't mean it's constantly increasing. There are some moments where it increases a little and then it's going to obviously go down, but the general trajectory of this time period is that the government is getting more and more involved, taking on responsibilities for more things in societies, pushing for greater rights for more people, and that's what I want us to know about this story. So I want to break this down because there are some really, really important key concepts that you have to know. Embedded within this first the second story on the increased role of government, you have to understand the progressive era. So I actually had some students that sent me responses that they really need help understanding the progressive era. In order to understand the progressive era, you just have to understand that the progressive era is a reaction to the Second Industrial Revolution. It is a reaction to laissez-faire government. So in period 6, there's these massive changes that are happening in society that we've already talked about. All of a sudden, Americans are shifting from an agricultural society to a more industrial society. People are leaving farms and they are moving into cities. They're doing different types of work. Businesses are growing at an astronomical rate. They're becoming more powerful than anyone had ever kind of foreseen them to be prior to this time period. And what a lot of people are doing is they're starting to call for a government to create like more regulations or rules to try to, I guess, maybe fix some of the problems that are created from these changes, but also to kind of keep especially big businesses in check. And so it's kind of this calling for limitations on capitalism, kind of calling on limitations to that old philosophy of laissez-faire. And so the progressive era is really, I guess it's unified by a lot of people who believe that the government should play a more active role in the lives of its people, and that the government should be a force for fixing these issues. The progressives themselves, most of them are middle class, like city dwellers, urbanites, who are kind of driving this movement. And it starts at the grassroots level. It starts in cities and then moves to the state level. And by the time Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in 1901, we've got the beginnings of a national progressive program. So progressives want to do a number of things. They want to regulate business. They want to protect consumers. They want to also create more efficiency, and that is all part of this the progressive ideals. So what comes out of that? It starts with the muckrakers who are identifying these problems. We see that with, for example, Jacob Riis, Upton Sinclair, who they're journalists who are kind of identifying some of these problems and letting the public know what's happening and some of the side effects from period 6. And then you've got the progressives, people like Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, and then Teddy Roosevelt, who becomes president, coming in and proposing solutions to these issues. So Teddy Roosevelt's solution, for example, is the Square Deal. And the Square Deal emphasizes 3 C's, which is consumer protection, regulation of corporations, and finally, conservation. So through Teddy Roosevelt, he busted up trusts. He tried to protect the environment and some of our resources. And on top of that, he also tried to create rules that would make consumers protected from things like meat products that were unsanitary, or medicine that didn't work and was in some cases dangerous. So the progressives made a lot of changes in American society from really 1890 all the way till the end of the progressive era, kind of coincides with World War I. World War I is what kills the progressive era, because it refocuses our attention on foreign affairs. The one area that we see the progressive movement really not accomplishing a lot is that we don't see them really doing all that much to improve the civil rights for African Americans. And so it's not that there weren't voices that were out there that were pushing for civil rights for African Americans. There was Booker T. Washington. There's W.E.B. Du Bois. Ida B. Wells is writing about the violence that African Americans have faced in the South. By the 1920s, you've got Marcus Garvey, who's advocating for Black nationalism. So you've got these civil rights leaders that are present, that are vocal during this time period, but we don't see the same amount of laws and progress being made for African Americans during this time period as we do for, say, consumer protection, or for protecting the environment, or maybe regulating corrupt politics. All right, so just being aware of that. We do see some major improvements to women's rights, however. And it's during this time period that we see a culmination of first wave feminism, which we can trace all the way back to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So first wave feminism was this movement that kind of found its root in the reform era of period 4, and it was for greater legal rights for women. And women had been pushing for more rights, the right to vote, greater protections over property, more liberal divorce laws, and so on. And we start to see some of those successes culminate in this time period, especially with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And of course, that's going to create like a new movement for women to find other rights as well, like, for example, more protections over their body. We see that with the rise of Margaret Sanger in the 1910s and the 1920s. So this is just a part of story two. Story two continues, and that's why like this is probably one of the biggest stories to know about period 7, because there's so much here. The progressive era dramatically expands the role of government. The government is doing things that it had never done before. Never really before this time period do we see government breaking up trusts, on ending monopolies. We don't see governments going in and tell businesses that they have to like meet certain standards for their food sanitation. But now the government's doing these things. They're going in and they're like making sure that living conditions are meeting certain types of standards, that like workplaces have certain basic levels of safety precautions being taken for their workers. So the government's doing all these new things. In the 1920s, especially after World War I, we start to see a little bit of a pushback on that. So in the roaring 20s, in the 1920s, after World War I is over, there's kind of this movement away from the role of government and more to like a pro-business era, which leads to new kind of calls for laissez-faire. And so in the 1920s, in the aftermath of World War I, there is like a greater emphasis on like the changing morality, the changing culture, consumerism of the 1920s. And we see like people like Henry Ford, and now and industrialists like him and even Thomas Edison kind of being the leaders in American society, as well as like obviously cultural icons like Charles Lindbergh and Babe Ruth. And the government in the 1920s is taking a back seat. So we see politicians playing less a role in society during this time period. We've got a series of forgettable presidents, including like Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Even have Herbert Hoover, who's best known not for his accomplishments as president, but rather the fact that he is in office when the Great Depression happens. And so what ends up happening in the 1920s is that once again there's this era of big business and there's a laissez-faire, and it culminates by the end of the decade in the Great Depression and the stock market crash. Now, the response by Herbert Hoover is, for the most part, hands off. You know, he sympathizes with the fact that the Great Depression is happening. He knows that it's troubling for a lot of Americans, but he's slow to take action because he fears that if the government gets too involved, that people will lose their independence. People will lose their individuality and become too reliant on government. And so he doesn't take a lot of action. He's slow to react to the stock market crash. And because of that, in 1932, he loses the election to FDR. Now, FDR has a much, much different view of government. And what he's going to do is he's going to significantly increase the size of government in ways that we've never seen before. And he does this through his New Deal. Now, he doesn't have a specific plan for fixing the Great Depression. Instead, he is just experimenting by using government and creating all these different agencies that had never existed before to try to deal with the high unemployment, to deal with the growing homelessness, to deal with the economic challenges that Americans were facing during this time period. And so you have to know that he's creating, like we call it, the alphabet soup of government. There's all those different programs that you have to know that were associated with the New Deal that shows the government taking on, I guess, new responsibilities. So the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that is insuring banks so that they won't close. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, that's putting young men to work doing conservation jobs and working in like our parks. The Social Security Act, which is guaranteeing pensions for the elderly, which is something that had never been done before. You've got obviously other ones as well, Agricultural Adjustment Agency, or AAA, which is providing subsidies for farmers so that they will grow less and hopefully adjust farm prices to halt inflation and give farmers, I guess, more money off of the food that they're growing. And of course, there's others as well. There's the WPA, which is a huge program that's creating like jobs for Americans. And that's a big deal. Like, the government hadn't done these things before. Government was not supposed to be responsible for creating jobs. That was the responsibility of big business. Government wasn't supposed to provide pension programs. People were supposed to save money for themselves. This is part of the new role of government that is being taken on during this time period. And we see that obviously with like the growth of Keynesian economics. The government is spending more and more money in order to try to fix the economy. We actually see some examples of that right now. Right now they're worried about the economy that's happening as a result of the pandemic. And so what are they doing? There's this massive stimulus system that's going on to put more money in people's pockets in order to try to hope that they'll spend that money and it'll either provide them with some sort of support, or they can help maybe boost the economy, which is suffering at this moment. Now, there's other obviously things that are happening with the Great Depression, the New Deal. The key here is understand what the Great Depression is, what caused it, and how the government is responding to it, and how it's affecting people both economically, politically, and socially. And so I have here, like, if you'll notice, like, there's a ton of different terms that are on all of these slides. That's because there's an enormous amount of Quizlet terms for period 7. I would probably recommend that you have more than your normal 5 Quizlet terms for each of these stories, because they're so dense. And there's just so much stuff here. And so, like, this might be one of those sheets that you just have a little bit more on it, because there is just so many things to remember. What you choose is completely up to you, but this is just an example of that. Okay, now the key here is understanding that the government is not what pulled us out of the Great Depression. What actually pulled us out of the Great Depression was World War II, and that takes us into our final story. So our final story is America taking on the role of an interventionist country. And for those who don't know what interventionism is, it's when we take on the role of going in and getting involved in affairs overseas. This was not necessarily a smooth transition. The United States had flirted with this idea of being a world power, but it had rejected its role early on. So it starts with this concept of World War I. This story picks up where imperialism left off. World War I was, the United States getting involved in European affairs without being directly, I guess we weren't directly attacked. There's a number of reasons for World War I. There was, obviously, we had economic ties with the Allies, Great Britain and France. There was also the fact that Americans were being killed in the crossfire by German submarines, which angered a lot of Americans. There was also, Woodrow Wilson's desire to spread democracy. So this idea that if America got involved, we could have maybe a place at the table of the peace negotiations. We could help, kind of create a lasting peace for Europe, and we would be able to increase our role in the world and spread our ideas overseas. So we get involved in World War I for those reasons, but it doesn't go the way that Americans think it does or think it should. The Treaty of Versailles ends up not really kind of representing a lot of what we hoped it would. It doesn't. Woodrow Wilson had gone to Europe with the 14 points, hoping that this would be a blueprint for lasting peace. Most of those 14 points were ignored, and really the League of Nations, which was supposed to be this peace organization created after World War I, was one of the only things that ended up becoming part of the treaty. And even then, a lot of Americans were skeptical of it because they felt that we would lose our autonomy. And so in the aftermath of World War I, rather than accepting this role as an interventionist world power who was going to basically help police the world and protect people and democracy overseas, there's an immediate backlash to that, which happens in the form of isolationism. So immediately following World War I, America begins to isolate itself. We actually step back from world affairs. We reject the Treaty of Versailles. We don't join the League of Nations. We pass like the Washington Naval Conference and a bunch of other things that are designed to allow us to like promote peace, but also stay out of European affairs. And in the interim between World War I and World War II, the United States is for the most part not getting heavily involved in what's happening in the world. We're very concerned with what's happening on our part of the world here in the United States, especially after the Great Depression hits. So America becomes really focused on, okay, how do we fix our economy? And as we do that, there are these rise of dictators that happen, and the United States takes very few actions to try to stop that. So America issues the Stimson Doctrine after, for example, the Japanese invade Manchuria. And obviously then later they're going to spread into China. And it's a worded document that basically says, you know, we disagree with this, but it doesn't really have any teeth to it. We're not really taking serious action to stop Japanese aggression in China, who was an ally of ours. We don't do anything to stop Italy from expanding into Ethiopia. We kind of ignore the appeasement that's happening in Europe as Hitler rejoins with Austria, takes over part of Czechoslovakia. Even as he invades Poland, the United States kind of is committed to what's happening here in our country. We're isolated, and we don't think it's any of our business. Well, that all changes as obviously some of our allies fall. And by 1940, it becomes apparent to our president at the time and to an increasing number of Americans that we need to get more involved in world affairs. So we see America entering this like preparedness. So the Neutrality Acts had been in place in the 1930s, and they had prevented us from getting involved in World War II. But after our president, FDR, essentially over time strips down these Neutrality Acts, does a number of things to work around them and to get involved in the war. So we see like a peacetime military draft. We see the passage of the Lend-Lease Act, where we just start sending goods to Great Britain, who's one of the last democratic countries that's holding out against Hitler in World War II. And then after the attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor, America becomes actively involved in the war. And this is a really important step in American foreign policy, because World War II is that moment that America fully kind of assumes the role of a superpower. We had been considered a growing world power all the way since the era of imperialism, maybe even to an extent a little before that, but we had never really embraced that role fully, and we're going to start to see America doing that during World War II. So America is going to kind of embrace that concept. We are going to like throw all of our power into World War II, largely through like industrial production. So all of our factories get converted to the war effort, and like a draft is happening. America is sending soldiers overseas, but they're also rationing. They're also everyone is recycling and doing what they can to prepare, like to help with the war effort here. There's the creation of new programs like the Manhattan Project to support the war effort. And by the end of that war, we can see America as a major world power with like some of the conferences that are taking place at the end, like the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference, the establishment of the United Nations, which the United States is now becoming a part of, and we're embracing this role. World War II transforms America into the world power that it will become in period 8 and to this day in period 9. So it's a really, really important event. It's also going to obviously set the stage for a lot of changes that will come after the war, including a growing civil rights movement. We got the Double V campaign, for example, during World War II. You've got a women's rights movement that's emerging afterwards, because we see Rosie the Riveter during World War II as well. You've got America becoming a nuclear power. And that's obviously going to be part of one of the defining things that happens during the Cold War. So much of what happens afterwards is set up by World War II. Okay, now here's the thing. There's even more stories in here than I can even talk about. And you can notice, like, as we look at some of these Quizlet terms, that there's a lot more that I haven't had. I just don't have time to go over. So really take a look at all those Quizlet terms. Really be selective with what you choose to put into your period review sheet so that you know, you're creating a well-rounded review that'll give you as many opportunities to answer all types of questions that you might see on the day of the DBQ. The last two DBQs from like the previous two AP tests have come from period 7. Like last year was the progressive era DBQ, and the year before that was on imperialism. So is it very possible that there could be another period 7 DBQ? Absolutely. Definitely don't count it out, and make sure that you have this information down and that you're ready to go for your practice test this week and for the day of the AP test. All right, that's all I got for you. If anyone has any kind of questions, you can send them to me via chat. Other than that, if you got to go, I totally understand. And I will continue to run some evening reviews as the week goes on, as I'm just going to try to be available for you guys as much as I can to help you as you get ready for the test next Friday. Have a great one.